Hello and welcome to this webcast lecture about Karl Marx, the German philosopher, economist and revolutionary who, with the help and support of his co-author Friedrich Engels, wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848 and Das Kapital, a multi-volume work on the historical development of capitalism, which was published between 1867 and 1894 in several volumes. The final volumes of Das Kapital were published after Marx's death and were edited by Engels. Marx was an economist. He actually had very little regard for the subject of philosophy, and his political theory, according to subsequent critics, is somewhat underdeveloped and perhaps even a little naive. So we can start really with his economics, as they are set out in Das Kapital and in another book, The Theory of Wages, Prices and Profits. Here he sets out a version of the labour theory of value, which was first enunciated by David Ricardo. Labour theory of value says that long-term, the exchange value of all goods and commodities is dependent upon the amount of labour power that's been expended in producing them, and not on their simple scarcity. I discussed that in the webcast lecture on David Ricardo, the idea why a bucket of water and a bucket of diamonds might be priced differently in the desert and on the one hand and in England on the other hand. All of that, if you're not clear about the labour theory of value, then go back and have a listen to that. Marx tried to make economics central to the understanding of human life and of the development of society. He sees economic activity as the motive power of history. For Aristotle, you might think, for Aristotle, man really is the rational animal, the creature that can think, that can use logic. For Plato, man is the political animal. For Kant, man is the moral animal, the creature that knows the difference between right and wrong innately. For Hegel, man is the historic animal, who knows that it's got a past and speculates about the future. Now for Marx, man is all of these. Above all, man is the productive animal, the creature that creates its own conditions of existence. Now Marx and Engels claimed that their method was scientific. They criticised other socialists. The socialist movement had taken on its modern form really in France in the 1820s and 1830s, and socialism was widely discussed. Marx was not a socialist in the early years of his life when he was a student. He adopted socialist politics when he was in what amounted to exile in Paris in the 1830s. But he denounced all the French socialists as utopians. They had these kind of pipe dreams about ideal societies. Marx claimed that his socialism was scientific socialism, and a good deal of his book, The Communist Manifesto, is spent criticising the existing socialist thinkers for their lack of understanding of the reality of historical development, and essentially for their utopian wishful thinking. So Marx claimed that his method was scientific, and you have to grant the fact that he did amass huge amounts of evidence on which he based his conclusions, and he did most of this in the 1840s and 1850s when he truly was in exile. He'd been banned from writing and living first in Germany and then in Belgium, and ended up living in England. Famously, he used to visit the British Library day in, day out, and there he availed himself of the massive amount of empirical data that the bureaucratic British state had begun to collect since about the 1820s, and with increasing systematisation through the 1830s and 1840s. So the operation of the new Poor Law that was brought into force in 1834, for example, was based on collecting huge amounts of data for parliamentary commissions. This data was kept, and it dealt with wages, prices, commodity prices, demographic information, the age at which people got married, the price of bread, the price of housing, etc., etc. And Marx dived into this information and based all his conclusions about the way in which society was developing on this mass of data. It's really the first economist, perhaps even really the first social thinker of any note, who based his conclusions to such a large extent on empirical data. So moving on, this tells us something about Marx's philosophical method, or perhaps it's more accurate to say his stance on philosophy. He was not keen on philosophy, and he wrote a book called The Poverty of Philosophy, which was ridiculing and satirising the French socialists, Proudhon had written a book called The Philosophy of Poverty. In the Philosophy of Poverty in the Poverty of Philosophy, and in other works such as The German Ideology, Marx ridicules the idea of pure reason, that you can work things out simply by cognitive effort in the manner of René Descartes. I think, therefore I am, that you can speculate and arrive at valid conclusions from reasoning. In this respect, Marx is rather like David Hume, who rejected any kind of conclusions based on reasoning that were not based on empirical fact. So Marx had a very low opinion generally of philosophy. He calls it ideology, meaning a sort of worldview that is very often a self-justification for the existing social setup, for the status quo. So he sees philosophy as intrinsically a conservative activity which justifies the morals and ethics of the existing society. It's all a lot of hot air that's designed to moralise and make morally right whatever the existing conventions of society are. Marx's view of religion is very like this. He clearly sees Catholicism as sort of the ideology of the feudal social system, and Protestantism and Methodism as essentially the ideology of the capitalist society. Anyway, despite this, Marx said that he was a follower of Hegel, that he read the philosophy of Hegel and claimed to understand it, which is a remarkable achievement in its own right. He was associated in Germany with a movement of essentially a liberal, not socialist movement, a liberal called the Young Hegelians. The leading figure in the Young Hegelian movement was a man called Ludwig Feuerbach, who stated an idea which would be very commonplace now, that God is created in the image of man. The claim of the Bible is that God created man in his own image. Well, Feuerbach simply inverts that and say, no, our idea about God is simply based on what we know about mankind. Places existing in other realms, that the Garden of Eden is a real place, and the Garden of Eden would be an ideal society. So put simply, for Feuerbach and his followers, God is made in the image of man. Marx accepted this idea, but in one of his earlier writings, the Thesis on Feuerbach, Marx wrote that philosophers have interpreted the world in various ways, but the point is to change it. He disagreed with Feuerbach that the world would naturally evolve towards a perfect society once people simply realised that their fate was in their own hands. That wasn't enough. It was necessary for people via political means to create such an ideal society. Welcome to the second part of this webcast lecture about Karl Marx, which is given in a series of 10-minute segments so that it's easier to use. I finished the previous segment by talking very briefly about Marx's thesis on Feuerbach, in which he makes the famous remark that philosophers have interpreted the world in various ways, but the point is to change it. The criticism there was of the Young Hegelians and the idea that there were natural forces at work in the world that would achieve a perfect society. Marx rejects this. He takes from Hegel a kind of teleological view that the human race is on a sort of journey from barbarianism through certain stages of history. Those stages of history are the common anthropological stages that an empiricist like Adam Smith also used, that there were known stages. There was barbarism and then slavery and feudalism and to liberalism, which Marx typifies as capitalism. So there are history is a process. He takes that much from Hegel, but he doesn't agree with the Young Hegelians that there's anything natural about this progress towards perfect society, and people will have to actually get off their backsides, as it were, and make the necessary changes to society in order to achieve this utopia. So throughout his writings, Marx defines himself as a follower of Hegel, an admirer of Hegel, and his philosophical system, insofar as Marxism is philosophy, is almost entirely Hegelian. But he uses Hegel mainly in a negative way to criticise the mechanistic materialism, as he calls it, of the British empiricists and the British political economists. Now, what he means by mechanistic materialism is what we've previously discussed as empiricism arising from the Enlightenment, the scientific method, the method in the physical sciences of Newton, and the idea that God is a clockmaker, that he created all this celestial clockwork, which Newton believed he'd accurately described in its laws of motion, and which the social scientists, the early social thinkers of empiricism, people like Locke and perhaps Hume, had also attributed this mechanistic approach to society, to human behaviour as well. You can see this above all in the liberal philosophy of utilitarianism. People are rather like soulless machines. They respond to stimuli. They're trying to avoid pain and maximise their utility or their happiness. That's there as well, of course, in the economics of Adam Smith. People really are like these soulless, spiritless machines, which can be manipulated by, for example, the price mechanism, the hidden hand of the market, and so on. Karl Marx doesn't accept this type of extreme materialism, this mechanistic materialism, this kind of non-spiritual way of looking at people. He describes it as bourgeois ideology, meaning a worldview that has been erected really to challenge feudal worldview of, in the preface to Das Kapital, Karl Marx writes, quote, "I am a disciple of Hegel and the presumptuous chattering classes who believe they have dismissed and buried this eminent thinker are ridiculous. The pure materialist or empiricist rejection of philosophical idealism." Marx continues by saying, "But I have taken the liberty of adopting a critical attitude towards my master, Hegel, to rid his dialectic of mysticism and thus to subject it to profound change." In place of this mechanistic materialism, Karl Marx advocates dialectical materialism, or at least Friedrich Engels did. It's not clear that Marx himself ever used that term. And in subsequent years, the whole system of dialectical materialism has been criticised as a type of dogma that Marx himself never employed. The phrase Marx does use quite a lot is the materialist conception of history, and this seems to do the same job, as it were, as dialectical materialism in Marxist dogma. Marx, by the way, famously said, "I am not a Marxist." This was in the last decades of his life when some of his ideas were beginning to be adopted by socialist political parties around Europe. He didn't like the kind of fossilization of some of his views, such as the promulgation of this idea of dialectical materialism. Nevertheless, if we draw a line between the empiricists and materialists on the one hand, and the religious thinkers and idealists on the other, it's very clear that Marx is on the materialist side of that divide. But he's differentiating himself from what he calls the crude materialists, such as John Locke, for example, by bringing back in a historical context to their laws of universal human rights and so on. So in the thesis on Feuerbach, Karl Marx says that human personality, for example, is not just the result of social circumstances. People are not the tabula rasa, the blank slate on which the world writes, as in the philosophical system of John Locke and also in the outlook of David Hume. Marx says that the materialist doctrine concerning changing circumstances and upbringing in shaping personality forgets that circumstances are made by men and that the educator himself must be educated. And the same would be true of doctrines of universal rights. The question would arise, well, who says? I mean, who is determining these rights? And the act of promulgating universal individual rights, the right to property, for example, the right to personal individual property, is not a universal law. It's part of historical development in Hegelian terms. And again, Marx says, the question whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking is not a question of theory, but a practical question. So once again, knowledge arises from interaction with the world, and political ideas therefore arise as a result of political struggle, of a conflict or a war, or a political battle of some sort. Ideas don't just come out of anywhere, as in idealism, but at the same time it is possible for people to have transcendent ideas, which is really impossible in the strictly mechanistic materialist view of human nature promulgated by a person such as Adam Smith. So Marx takes from Hegel the idea of perpetual change, of dialectical change, and his analysis is always historical, that if you're looking at claims to universal rights. You've got to look at where they came from historically. And the key to this, he says famously in the Communist Manifesto, is that the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle. The key to history is not, as Hegel thought, the contention between abstract principles of good and evil all the time, resulting in the synthesis on Earth as such entities of the Prussian state. The Prussian state was the result of the eternal struggle between good and evil. Karl Marx changes that entirely. He says he stands Hegel on his feet. He's sometimes misquoted as saying he stands Hegel on his head, although I think that misquote is very helpful. It's very indicative. So he's taking the Hegelian dialectical system of starting point, that's the thesis, its opposite, the antithesis, and the struggle between those two things, the synthesis, as the way in which change happens in the world. But that's not between abstract principles, it's between real contending groups of people with different desires, different objectives, different needs, and these real groups in history Marx describes as the classes. So we've reached the key idea for Marx of class and class struggle, and so that's a good point at which to break off and end part 2 of this webcast lecture about Karl Marx. Hello and welcome to part 3 of this webcast lecture about Karl Marx. We ended part 2 by discussing the key idea of class and class struggle. Now, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx says that in different epochs, the two central contending classes have had different names and were differently constituted. There was freeman and serf in the Middle Ages, but these days the class struggle boils down more and more to bourgeois and proletarian. These are the two central classes with irreconcilable differences. They're like protons and electrons. They would annihilate each other and they define each other, and they're constantly clashing with each other. It's always the same story throughout history. Two classes will be locked in a life and death struggle, and the state will be there either, and this is most often the case, as the actual means that one class dominates another class, or sometimes the state operates as a broker between the two main contending classes when neither of them is strong enough to rule in its own right. And this is Marx's view of the French Revolution. The peasants overthrew the monarchy, but they did not have the political strength to govern themselves and to entirely dominate the country. And so Napoleon arrived as a broker between the two. Napoleon's independent strength, the independent strength of the state to act as a dictatorship and lord it over society, was based on the fact that none of the classes in civil society could control him. And this is the idea of Bonapartism that Karl Marx in his political writing frequently refers to. Now then, the two classes within capitalist society, according to Marx, are the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and we need to define those a little more carefully. Bourgeois is a French word, and in the Communist Manifesto he describes how that comes from the word itself means town dweller, and it comes from the medieval guilds who lived in towns and who had special rights granted by the king, and how that developed into an independent power. So that by the time of 1830 and the coup that brought Louis Philippe to power in France as king of the French people, Louis Philippe was no longer a feudal king. He was a constitutional monarch under the influence, under the power of his bankers, who were bourgeois, and the parliament that was dominated by bourgeois representatives. So that's the bourgeoisie. These are the owners of the means of production. They own, ultimately, through the banking system, all the factories, all the farms, virtually all the property in society is mortgaged and ultimately owned and controlled by the bourgeoisie. The modern capitalist state, Karl Marx writes, is nothing more than a committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie and for constituting the bourgeoisie as a class. The bourgeoisie are in a constant battle, sometimes, Marx says in the Communist Manifesto, sometimes open, sometimes underground, sometimes not acknowledged. And they're in a constant battle with the proletariat. Who are the proletariat? They are the landless ex-peasants, the factory workers, coal miners, people with no property at all, no traditional role in society anymore, no traditional status. They own absolutely nothing. Perhaps they own the shirt on their back, so to speak, but nothing beyond that. They own nothing by the way of capital that can enable them to produce their own means of life. They have to buy everything they need from the bourgeoisie. They have to sell their labour, and essentially their labour is all they have to sell. They are given bourgeois constitutional rights in capitalist society, as in the French and American constitutions, and as in the constitutional monarchy of England. They ultimately even get the vote. But these rights, in line with the natural philosophy of John Locke, are not much use to them, because what's the use of a theoretical right to own property when you don't really have the means to do so? What's the worth of the theoretical right to freedom of speech when you do not own a newspaper? So this is the proletariat, and they're not to be confused with generally the poor or peasants. Peasants at least own their own farm to some extent and have a means of supporting themselves and have a kind of autonomy and a resistance, therefore, to the capitalist state. The poor, the lumpen proletariat, are simply non-historical people for Karl Marx. They play no role in history at all. But the proletariat, because they are increasingly gathered in the booming cities of the 19th century, they live together in the same slum areas, they work together in coal mines, they work together in giant factories, are capable of constituting themselves as a class and therefore contending in political terms with the bourgeois class for control of the state. The first time that happens, by the way, in history for Karl Marx is during the Revolution of 1848, the June days, when the working class part of the insurgency against the bourgeois monarchy of Louis Philippe in 1848 separated themselves from the liberal bourgeois revolutionaries who simply wanted liberal constitutional rights and demanded positive action by the state to create national workshops to provide jobs for all the unemployed. So you can see how that is a very different set of political demands. These are proletarian political demands to use the state to organise the economy and take it away from the bourgeoisie. Very, very different from the revolution of 1830 in France, or the first phase of the revolution in 1848, which was the now familiar liberal demand for constitutional rights, a free trade, the private ownership of the economy. The proletariat failed in 1848. The rebellion of the June days, when they erected barricades to keep the national workshops open and to effectively inaugurate a socialist reorganisation society, couldn't happen because the proletariat at that time was very small in relative terms in France. And secondly, they didn't have proper political leadership. They hadn't understood what they were up against, essentially, and were suffering from all kinds of what Marx would have thought of as delusions, that by joining in with the liberal demands for a better parliament, they could get their needs met that way. They had failed really to have what Marx calls class consciousness, and understanding that they must destroy and overthrow the bourgeois liberal state entirely and supplant it with what Marx calls the dictatorship of the proletariat. Nevertheless, Marx thinks that the proletariat throughout the 19th century is the class with the most revolutionary potential for moving the whole of humanity towards a kind of ultimate freedom, towards the Hegelian idea of recreating the Garden of Eden. So Marx has that idea, but what he's saying is Hegel is right about that. Marx is kind of saying society should evolve towards a new Garden of Eden on Earth, but that's not in some heavenly realm, that's right here on Earth. And the people who are most capable of creating that are not the bourgeoisie, and certainly not the feudal monarchs, perhaps not even the peasantry, whose idea of a perfect society is just to have their own little farm and a few cows. But the idea of creating a new paradise on earth, the people who can do that are the proletariat, and they can do that on behalf of the whole of humanity because they are the people, as it says in the Communist Manifesto, who own nothing. They have nothing to lose but their chains. Furthermore, the proletariat is completely international. If you're a coal miner, it doesn't make any difference whether you're down in the bowels of the earth in France or Germany or Brazil or China or anywhere. So the proletariat, because they own nothing, really are a non-national class. It's the bourgeoisie who are very keen to establish ownership within national units to create the idea of the modern romantic liberal national state. The working class, the proletariat, have nothing to gain from that idea at all. Ultimately, that romantic nationalism ends up in war between France and Germany. And in those wars, the best option really for the proletariat is for the workers or the proletariat in Germany and in France and throughout the world to all join together and overthrow their respective bourgeois rulers rather than killing each other. And with those remarks on what Karl Marx sees as the need of the proletariat to constitute itself as an international class, workers of all countries unite into one formation, we end this third part of this webcast lecture about Karl Marx. Hello and welcome to the fourth part of this webcast lecture about Karl Marx, where we're continuing the discussion of Marx's concept of the proletariat and its role within history. So the proletariat is a new force in the 19th century. It's a class with the most revolutionary potential. They have nothing to lose but their chains. The poor had always been a factor in history. Poor peasants in the past did have something to lose. They had their position in the feudal hierarchy, including a right to poor relief. They were a valued part of the parish within the ideology of feudalism. They had a type of security within the Christian ideology. Where Jesus is the Lord, the feudal Lord, everybody has a role within that system. Everybody has some value. Now Marx is saying all that is gone with the abolition of feudalism, with the rise of liberalism, free trade, feudalism, capitalism. Then all that's gone, and all the former peasants have is worthless constitutional rights, such as the right to own property, but they have none increasingly, particularly in England, where the peasantry was almost entirely cleared off the land to create bourgeois, capitalist, industrial farming. That was less true in other parts of Europe. Peasants managed to hang on, heavily armed, it has to be said, with their sickles and pikes and things, the attempts of the liberals to take that land off them. But nevertheless, and for that reason, the persistence of the peasantry in France and especially Russia, of course, but also in Germany, probably slowed the process of capitalist economic development. But in England, really, after the Highland clearances, there were no peasants to speak of at all in England. And that's something we discussed before. It's reflected very much in the very, very horrible food culture of England. One good thing about peasants is they do like to take their time producing the food, and it's often much nicer. But anyway, that's a bit of a digression. So here we have the proletariat. They have these legal rights. Even towards the end of the century, they granted the vote, but these rights are not effective because they have no access to the means of production. And this is the key idea for Karl Marx. We need to get our head round this, what he means by the means of production. This is a special type of property that is used to create property. So a factory, for example, well, the best example of all would be a machine tools factory. A factory that makes machinery. That's capital. It's very, very different from private property. And again, it's often held against Marx that he wanted to do this ridiculous utopian idea where there would be no property at all, property as theft. That phrase is often attributed to Marx. That's not right. That was Proudhon, who was a much more extreme thinker than Marx. Not all property is theft. Private property that one uses in one's own life is not the same type of thing as capital or the means of production. So a farm that is used to produce food, not for your own use, but for sale, that is the means of production, that is capital. A factory which is used to make commodities not for one's own consumption, but simply for sale in order to make money, in order to invest in similar factories, that is capital. A bank that produces money in order to finance those factories is also capital. So this is the means of production. Capitalist society, put very simply, is a very simple idea to understand in these terms. It's where the means of production are now owned by private individuals, by private bourgeois. In feudal society, those means of production, the factories such as they were, they would normally be thought of as guilds in the towns. The farmland predominantly was owned by the state, was owned predominantly by the king or by aristocrats who held that land in the name of the king by feudal right, that they were granted lands in return, very often for political favours or conquest in war. So for Marx, the character of society is defined overwhelmingly by one thing, which is the relationship of classes to the means of production. Feudal society, the means of production are owned by the king, the state, and people have defined roles within the productive process. This is a very stable system. It lasted for centuries. In a bad year with famines, everybody starved, but probably everybody almost right up to the aristocrats had a bad time. In a good year, everything was good. Capitalist society is very different. Now, the ownership of the means of production is in private hands. The peasants are replaced ultimately by a landless proletariat who can only sell their labour. There is no obligation on the part of the bourgeois to look after these people. The king has no role at all, except as a kind of ridiculous ceremonial figurehead, as Marx would see it anyway. And even the whole state, the police force, the educational system, even the church is a bourgeois church, which is there to consolidate the control, the private control of the means of production by the bourgeoisie. The philosophy and political philosophy that's characteristic of bourgeois society is of individual rights, the idea that anybody, since they're granted the right to property and they're granted the right to free speech and freedom of religion, anybody can pull themselves up, as it were, by their own bootstraps and become bourgeois. They can set up a factory and they can become bourgeois themselves. I mean, that is largely a fantasy. If you look at the actual facts of the matter, that happens so infrequently that it's almost like a miracle when that happens. Most of the bourgeois, in fact, are former landed aristocrats, certainly in England, who break free from the restraint of their obligations to the monarchy and the feudal state and establish themselves as owners of factories and mines and so on. Classic case is Castlereagh's family, Lord Londonderry. They were feudal landowners. They'd been granted their lands in Ireland after the conquest of Ireland by the Tudor monarchy. And they'd simply, kind of like robber barons, been given this land. So they were landed aristocrats, but they found on this land, because they also owned land in the north of England, coal. And so they developed that coal mining and then factories and so on and converted themselves from feudal aristocrats into bourgeois, into capitalists who then demanded the dissolution of the feudal obligations, the feudal restrictions on trade, things like the Corn Laws, things like tariffs and duties. They wanted low taxation, the free market and so on. So that's much, much more characteristic. It's bourgeois ideology, Marx would say, the idea that because everybody has these rights to property, they can become capitalists. That in practice, that never happens. at least in the 19th century society Marx was analysing, a later critique of Marx is that, in fact, ownership of capital became much more widespread in the 20th century because of reforms that Marx had not anticipated. For example, personal equity plans and the fact that lots and lots of people can own shares in companies now, and so there are that the bourgeoisie is no longer a kind of tiny cabal of super rich Lord Londonderry characters with top hats on, but that ownership of the means of production is in fact widely spread through the City of London, through share ownership, through pension funds, and so on. There are contrary arguments about that from Marx's contemporary followers, and so the argument goes on. But the same analysis of ownership of means of production in relation to class also defines for Marx socialism. Socialism is not some weird, fantastic scheme, such as those put forward by Fourier, Saint-Simon, the people that Marx criticised in the Communist Manifesto. And I think here Marx is certainly on very strong ground. And when everybody tries these sort of communes and alternative societies, they always end in tears and frequently and sometimes turn into sort of cults like the Jonestown Massacre and so on. That was an avowedly utopian socialist project where they all went off into the jungle of South America in the 1970s, and then next thing we knew they'd all killed themselves in a mass suicide thing. So that's socialism, utopian socialism. Scientific socialism for Marx is totally different. It's simply where the means of production are collectively owned by the state, which in Hegelian terms will act as a way of moving history forward, and also of the proletariat dominating the bourgeoisie and eliminating the bourgeoisie as a class, not necessarily killing them, but meaning that they're no longer constituted as a factor in society. So the state must own the whole means of production, and that is socialism. It's also the case that under socialism, he says some enterprises could be cooperatively owned, that the people who worked in them could take ownership of them. But essentially, socialism is nothing more or less for Marx than the liquidation of the bourgeoisie as a class constituted as a political force. Hello and welcome to the fifth part of this webcast lecture about Karl Marx. We ended part 4 by discussing Marx's definition of socialism as the social ownership of the means of production, either by worker cooperatives or by the state. The state would, in a socialist society, serve the purposes of the proletarian class, and the state would be used to own the means of production. The purpose of this is purely political, to wage class war or class struggle against the bourgeoisie. Without their ownership of the means of production, the bourgeoisie are nothing. They are no longer a historical force and simply disappear. Ultimately, Marx thought that the socialist state would then wither away. It's only there to wage this class struggle against the bourgeoisie once the bourgeoisie no longer exists. Increasingly, the state would be not a significant factor in people's lives. It would wither away. It would become, as he puts it in Das Kapital, the administration of things rather than people. Ultimately, the end game he sees as communism. So socialism he sees as a transitional phase towards the ultimate goal of history, which is communism. Communism is very, very similar to Kant's idea of the kingdom of ends, where everybody is treated as an end in their own right and not as a means to an end. So there would be nothing like employment or exploitation in economic terms in communism. It's also very like Hegel's idea of a perfect organic society, where there's no need for laws because everybody will always act in a way which is consistent with the good of all. So that's communism. But again, for Marx, difficult though this might be to believe, communism is not a utopian abstract idea or a principle to be aspired to. It's a realistic and in fact necessary goal of the historic processes he's been studying. So socialism and communism are very different. Socialism is only a transitional phase where the state abolishes the bourgeoisie. It will gradually fade away as worker cooperatives, other forms of communal organisation, self-governing communal organisation, of housing, of transport, of distribution and education. So housing estates or areas of housing would simply be run and administered by the people living in those houses, etc. All of that would be going on in socialism as he sees it. The fact that real socialism, when it came to be in the Soviet Union, was a terrible authoritarian nightmare is an interesting problem. But nevertheless, in the work of Marx, socialism is this transitional phase where the state steadily withers away and is replaced by communism. Communism is, and that would be the main difference. Communism and socialism are very different. Communism is characterized by there being no state at all. Communism is also, Marx thinks, very like the state of nature. We've discussed that before. It's a big theme in political philosophy. What is the state of nature? What were people like before the state existed? In other words, in prehistoric times, cavemen, if you like. Now, Marx is very much like Rousseau in this respect. He thinks that state of nature, which he calls primitive communism, people were essentially happy, as it were. It's nothing like Thomas Hobbes' idea of the continuous war of all against all. Marx calls Hobbes' view of the war of all against all, so you need a necessary state and police force and authoritarian rules. He calls that the atomic theory of bourgeois society, where, like in Smith's idea of the hidden hand of the market, everyone's competing with each other. Marx and Engels, who wrote more extensively about this, thought that prehistoric society was more likely to be characterized by cooperation of various sorts. And unlike Thomas Hobbes, Marx and Engels did have access to some data, to some empirical information, because anthropology in the 19th century had discovered and was beginning to systematically discover such Stone Age societies as still existed around the world, such as in Borneo and also in North America. When we think of the North American Indians, we think of the Plains Indians, who were nomads and lived in teepees, but there were others who lived in settled communities of long houses. And these long houses were actually rather characteristic of real Stone Age society that could be observed. And in these long houses, the system of social organisation is very like communism. There's no there's personal. People have personal property, but they don't have private property. That the agriculture, the fields, the productive things that they have, rudimentary ploughs or whatever, are seen as communal property, and nobody would dream of owning the plough that was associated with the longhouse and kind of charging people to use it. So Marx's idea is that human nature is communist, that prehistoric society before the state was communist, and therefore the communism he's talking about is a higher form of communism. And in very, very Hegelian terms, what's happened here is that in the beginning mankind was communist. It went through this period of alienation, of war and conflict and class division, and ultimately man is reunited with its nature in higher communism. And how this is achieved is because of the political self-awareness of the proletariat, which becomes the universal class, the class in the struggle of bourgeois society that ultimately encompasses everybody, because the dynamics of capitalist society towards monopoly, towards merger of companies, is to ensure that everybody ends up in the proletariat. Everybody ends up really owning nothing of the means of production and dependent on selling their labour power. So capitalism has revolutionized feudal society, abolished its class divisions. Capitalism is a tremendously powerful, positive, historical, revolutionary force for Marx, because it creates the proletariat, and the proletariat is the whole of humanity without any class divisions. And this class, once they realize who they are, will be capable of leading a proletarian revolution. And this will happen on a worldwide basis with no further divisions of class, no divisions of nationality. And the proletariat will become self-consciously the whole human race and will re-inaugurate the kingdom of ends, the organic society, rebuild the Garden of Eden on Earth.